Welcome to our second annual conference for Division 10, focusing on creativity, aesthetics, and the arts.
Welcome to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. In this episode, we're going to do something unprecedented. We're leaving the podcast studio, and we're going to Yale University. I'm going to take you to the world's most important annual creativity research conference. Once a year, the world's leading creativity researchers get together, and they give short 10-minute talks to each other to share their latest cutting-edge research. We just heard an official welcome to the conference from the president, Dr. Roni Reiter-Palmon. She's a professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. In this episode, you're going to hear research that's so new that it hasn't been published yet. This conference is where creativity researchers share their latest findings straight from the laboratory. I spent 2 days at Yale University at this conference, and I listened to many exciting research presentations. In between the talks, I did one-on-one interviews with 9 researchers to ask them to tell us about their latest research. If you're a creativity geek and you really want to dive deep, this is the episode for you. I chose 9 very different researchers so that you could get a sense of how broad and diverse today's creativity research is. This is really cutting-edge research, and it hasn't been translated into practical advice yet. There are going to be some technical terms, but if you stick with us, I think you're going to realize how important this research is for our understanding of creativity. I started out by speaking with Roni Reiter-Palmon because she's the president of the group, and I asked her to give us an introduction to this event and tell us a little bit about the history of the event. Could you tell us a little bit about APA Division 10? That's the American Psychological Association. So what does that mean, aesthetics and the arts?
Division 10 is the psychology of aesthetics, creativity, and the arts. We also have our own journal by the same name. And basically, people from this division are interested in the psychology of creativity, the psychology of aesthetic experience. So think about going to a museum and looking at pictures and what do you feel and what do you see, and then the psychology of the arts. So anything from drawing to theater, music, and so on.
The first researcher I talked to was Dr. Kristin Lamb. She's an assistant professor in gifted education and creativity at the University of Alabama. She studies the psychology of imagination because creativity involves imagining future possible worlds. You're imagining what might be. You might call it vision. Some people call it possibility thinking. In her conference presentation, she talked about a study that she did with her colleague Jeb Puryear. They did a huge analysis of every single scientific study of imagination in the past few decades. They ended up finding 40 total studies. They used a rigorous method called meta-analysis to tease out the most important discoveries. She's going to tell us what she and Dr. Puryear discovered about imagination and creativity. I'm here with Dr. Kristin Lamb, and she's got some new research that she presented here at the conference about imagination. So can you tell us what do you mean by imagination?
Yeah, so first, thanks for having me on here. We did a systematic review on imagination, the role of imagination in the creative process. And one of the research questions in that was, what is imagination? How are we defining it? How are we talking about it? And honestly, after reviewing close to 40 articles, we don't really have a good definition for imagination, kind of similar to what you see with creativity. The 2 components that come up a lot are mental imagery, basically that we rely on our former experience to create something new. And that's really kind of the 2 most consistent themes that you see, throughout those articles.
Right. When you say articles or you did a review, just to point out for our listeners, that means you went and found scientific research publications in scientific journals, and you got 40 of them. And then you said, I'm going to analyze everything that's ever been studied about imagination, and that's what you presented.
Yeah. So we pulled, after we put in, limitations in the databases and that sort of thing. I think we had 341 articles total.
Wow.
That where it just had to say imagination at least one time in the abstract. So 341 of those. And then after a series of reviewing those or screening, we boiled it down to close to 40 articles that really were relevant to the purpose of the study, right? Like we wanted to give it a closer look and see what those authors were saying, but they were all peer-reviewed, empirical studies that had to have imagination and creativity as kind of those primary components that they're looking at.
Right. So that's the solid scientific research, and your presentation is basically here's like the summary of everything we know about imagination and creativity.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why I thought we got to talk to you for this podcast. And so you said there are two big themes of imagination, and one of them is mental imagery. And what's that?
Yeah. So it's kind of that idea of, we come up with mental representations or symbols. One thing I think was important to note was that it's not just, we daydream, we fantasize and that sort of thing. And with that, you can kind of think of pictures that you have playing in your mind. But this could also be like goal setting or making a plan, right? You might envision yourself achieving that goal, and you kind of have a visual representation in your mind of what that might look like, or maybe what you need to do to get from point A to, point B.
And then the second theme, you said there were two, the mental imagery.
Yeah.
And
so you rely on your former experiences or your memories to create something new. I actually had attended another talk where they were talking about how certain creative aspects increase as we age. So I kind of thought that was interesting, even with the imagination piece, that it made me wonder, does our imagination grow as we age? Because if it's kind of built on this former experience and our memories, then it would stand to reason that that might actually increase too, if we rely on that to create these new things.
Well, does imagination include, like in my case, I'm thinking fantasy, like, I'm going to get really famous and I'll do a TED Talk, and, everybody will want to meet me and pay me money.
Yeah.
So is that that sounds like fantasy. Is that imagination?
Yeah. Well, so when we were doing this review, we've actually found a lot of articles that use like fantasy, proneness, pretend play, kind of those aspects. But where we had to cut some of those out was maybe because they didn't also focus on how that related to creativity.
Okay.
So you would see the like fantasy and like, there was actually some studies on dementia patients and, the nursing home. There was quite a few of those with fantasy proneness and that sort of thing. Really interesting, but they just didn't make the cut because they didn't have that creativity component.
So who does imagine about creativity more? Is it older people who imagine more about creativity? Are they children? I don't know who were included in all of these studies.
So honestly, a lot of the samples in the studies that were in our review are university students.
Right.
Like, go figure. That's kind of how most of the studies kind of work out, right? Because it's the most convenient sample, I think, to get, unfortunately. But I would like to see us do more with, school-age kids, adults. I'm a former science teacher, so I'm always looking for kind of that practical piece and, how we can kind of bridge that gap. So even with this review, my wheels are kind of turning as far as, how does this apply in a K-12 classroom? How do we support imaginative thinking? How do I help teachers to support, imaginative thinking? What does that look like? That kind of thing.
Well, thank you for talking to me. This is really powerful work. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Lamb's research on imagination was new to me, and that's what makes this annual conference so exciting. There are new things that even the most knowledgeable creativity researchers don't know about yet. I don't do research on imagination myself, but I think it's important for me to know about it anyway. It gives me new perspectives on how I think about creativity in my own research. The second researcher I talked to was Dr. Ahmad Rahimi. He's the director of a research lab with a great name. It's called Creative Learning Through AI in Stealth Assessment, and it's at the University of Florida. Dr. Rahimi is doing exciting research on artificial intelligence and creativity. He's going to tell us about an AI that he developed that designs its own new computer games. I'm here with Ahmad Rahimi. Ahmad, what are you talking about here at the conference?
Well, I'm talking about my research about using large language models to assess students' creativity when they create game levels or design game levels in this game called Physics Playground. And also we used large language models to create game levels. Just like human beings, we teach large language models about this game, the game mechanics and how it works, and then it creates the game for us. So I'm going to talk about how we did this in the process of evaluating this process with human raters and then the results. Long story short, the results show that if we use rubrics in this process, we can get a better response from large language models. Generally speaking, we can do some different tricks and techniques to get the large language models to respond the way we like in the lowest level possible, or with the lowest cost method that we can do it is through prompt engineering, and the high price or high cost thing or technique that we can do is fine tuning. So in this process, we just used prompt engineering and the results is quite really promising.
It's fascinating. So you're saying the AI is designing the game, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So the way we store the game levels in our server is through a database or data format called JSON. It's a very simple format where you have a variable and you have the value inside that variable. For example, these game levels are made of lines, and each line is made of dots or points. So the JSON file stores the point, the color of the lines, and if the line is active, dynamic, or no, it's fixed on the screen. So these information can be translated to the game environment, and when you enter to the game environment, you can see things acting like real life physics laws happen to them. So it's very easy for large language models to understand JSON format. So then we just need to have a conversation with a large language model explaining that these are the game mechanics, how it works, and this is how to store the game levels into JSON format. We provided some examples, some files, some JSON files with images, and large language model was able to create some very preliminary game levels. I wouldn't say they are very creative, but at least I can see something on the screen. So that's very promising.
So what is the connection with creativity?
The creativity part is that, it takes a lot of time and resources to assess creativity. Like in this case, the product that the students create is a game level. And in order to assess the creativity of that game level that they created, we needed 2 human beings at least to look at that level independently. But in this case, we are asking AI to do that, so it can be scaled up. It can be done in real time. And the future use case of this is I'm thinking about creating an agent in that environment that can help support the creativity of the students as they create the game levels, not as a post hoc thing, but as they are going through the process and create their game levels, the system understands what they are creating and it can provide some suggestions to improve their creativity.
It's fascinating research. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now we've heard from 2 of the researchers at the Creativity Conference. You're listening to The Science of Creativity. If you're enjoying these interviews, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and like the show and leave a comment, because this will help other people like you find the show. Now put together Dr. Lamb's presentation on imagination and Dr. Rahimi's presentation on AI in games, and you can tell this conference has a wide variety of research. I really enjoyed these first 2 interviews, and I also attended their presentations. Remember that they only had 10 minutes to talk about their findings. So Dr. Lamb and Dr. Purrier, for example, they did their meta-analysis of 40 different studies of imagination and creativity, and they had to squeeze all of that into just 10 minutes. It's an incredible skill, and it's something that academic researchers have to learn how to do. But it also means that for the attendees, you can see a lot of research in just one day. My next interview is with Dr. Shoshi Kesari. She's studying the creativity of improvisational theater. And I really loved that presentation because back in the 1990s, I myself did a major study of Chicago improv theater. That was when I played piano with a couple of different improv groups. I was improvising on piano along with the action on stage. And that gave me a great opportunity to videotape the performances. And later, I published my analyses of these performances in two of my first two books. One of them was called Improvised Dialogues, and the other one was called Group Creativity. Dr. Kesari studied improv theater with older adults, and I caught up with her on the first day of the conference. I'm here with Shoshi Kesari. And Shoshi, tell me a little bit about your presentation here.
Okay, thank you very much, Kit, for inviting me. So today we are going to speak about playful interactions that are based on improvisational theater with older adults. We observed it among the 150 participants in different ages, but most of them were older adults. And we could see that even after a very brief and short playful interaction that are based on improvisation, like association game, continuous story, mirror game, we could observe wonderful improvement in cognitive performance induced by digit span or even word fluency tests. We assume, and our hypothesis is that it's grounded in a physiological arousal that was also induced after very, very short playful interaction indicated by GSR and also ECG. And we are now investigating in different clinical and laboratory studies that we conduct.
It sounds like a lot of research. I think you said 150. How do you do it? Do you videotape them?
We are using mobile labs, and we go directly to the nursery homes and to adult day centers with suitcase and cameras and ECG and GSR and all the computer tests that we did for cognitive assessment. We conducted several studies. Some were conducted in face-to-face interaction and some were conducted in Zoom, but all in the lab. I mean, participants are coming. First, we do some assessment for cognitive functioning and also emotional and social functioning. And then they get to a different room. They meet a stranger, a new facilitator that conducts a brief playful interaction with them. And then we do another assessment. Sometimes we analyze video and face expressions to get some more objective assessment of their emotional experience during the game. We usually do a within subject design. So each participant experiences 1 week, one playful interaction or either a control condition. And in the following week, another interaction. The control condition is usually based on physical exercise and some verbal exercise and even personal conversation, which are quite good enough activities, but we can see a higher improvement in cognitive, social, and emotional measures after the playful interaction itself.
Right? It's very powerful research. So the focus on art, and can you say something about the links with creativity? Do you think this is fostering creativity? Is there some lesson for the rest of us about how to be more creative?
Yeah, so now we are going to collaborate on understanding how it also influences creativity in terms of diverse thinking. On also in the we did this test of word fluency that actually people had to retrieve as much as word as they can. So now we are going to do another analysis together also with Professor Ed Kennett to understand if this also changed the way they diverse thinking, the categories that they retrieved words through. And we also thinking about adding a more specific test for creativity that are adapted to the older adults. I mean, if you train with playful interaction for a long period, for example, how this is going to affect your adaptive abilities for the ongoing changes, situation that you experience in older age, because people experience many changes in their life in terms of cognitive changes and physical changes and the reduction of their social environment. So we assume that if you train with for long-term playful activities, you get more adaptive ability to cope with this changing environment. And we want to think about some creative test or creative assessment that is more suitable for the older population, like problem-solving issues and others.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you. That's powerful research.
Thank you very much, Kit, for inviting me. And my co-authors are, and my team is Professor Yulia Goland from the Rahimi University and Professor Boaz Ben David from Rahimi University. And we are very, very happy with our shared work together.
Dr. Kesari is a professor at the School of Creative Arts Therapies at the University of Haifa in Israel. This is a really international conference. I also talked to researchers from Europe, South America, India, and even from Japan. My next interview is with Professor Denis Dumas. He's an associate professor at the University of Georgia. His research is really different from these first three, and this interview is pretty technical, but I think you're going to get the key message that creativity is always a balance between being new and different on the one hand, as well as being useful or appropriate in some way on the other hand. You know, it might be cool to be radically original, but if no one else can understand it or figure out how to apply it, that originality is going to be wasted. It won't have an impact on the world. Dr. Dumas studied this tension in children's creativity, and to study this balance of novelty and appropriateness, he used a mathematical tool called Pareto optimization.
I'm here with Denis Dumas. Denis, tell me about your research here.
Happy to do it. I'm presenting on children's creative ideas, and specifically how kids balance originality and task appropriateness in their idea. Especially when you give a child a task like a typical divergent thinking task, like give me a surprising example of something that's blue. The most always blue things, all the kids know, so they're not very original. The most categorically representative are also relatively unoriginal. So the question is, how far afield is the child willing to leap? And so we have a big data set of thousands and thousands of children's responses to tasks like this. And we ran it through this really interesting model called a Pareto optimization model, which is actually used in engineering to balance competing attributes. Like, for example, in cars, it could be like horsepower and gas mileage, you know? And so we put in originality and task appropriateness as competing attributes. And I tried to identify the examples of children's ideas that as optimally as possible balanced those two attributes. So a way you could say it is we tried to identify the instances of children's ideation that navigated the trade-off between originality and task appropriateness the best or the most effectively.
Where did you get thousands of children, really? That sounds like a huge amount of data.
Well, it's actually about 400 kids, but they each responded to about 30 different tasks. So it's thousands of individual responses. And the whole analysis, at least for the talk today, is at the response level. So we're modeling each individual idea the children had as a giant data set of ideas. I've done other analyses at the level of the person before, but I guess for this one, I wanted to go dig a little deeper and go to the level of the ideas, try to find the ideas that were indicating an optimal balance between originality and task appropriateness. Because the thing is, especially for kids, they're not all that consistent across the items on a measure. So they could have a really original idea and then a relatively unoriginal idea on the next item. And I think sometimes doing response level analyses, it can be fruitful. So it's hundreds of kids, thousands of ideas.
So which ideas would be the most creative ideas? Could you give an example?
That's a good question. Actually, I don't think I'm sure. The way we set the model, it identified optimal balancing of originality and task appropriateness for every possible complementary weighting of those two. So like weighting originality at 0.99 and task appropriateness at only 0.1. And then everything all the way up to the opposite, where task appropriateness is weighted at 0.99 and originality is 0.1. So we actually identified optimal responses that are mainly task appropriate and not that original, but for their level of task appropriateness, they have maximized originality in our data set. So it's like saying that I'm stuck on cars for some reason in my head. Like for this level of horsepower, it gets the best gas mileage. And obviously you could optimize in multiple ways. You could have like a teeny little car that doesn't get a lot of horsepower, but it also doesn't burn a lot of gas. Or you could have like a bulldozer or something. I don't know. You need a lot of horsepower and you're actually okay to not have very good gas mileage. And so we have some ideas that are identified as optimal that are really highly original and relatively low appropriateness, as long as they are the optimal balance among the ideas in the data set. And then we have others on the other side of this spectrum. So it's actually it's fascinating. In the Pareto optimization model, they call it the front, kind of like a storm front. Like it's a region of the data set where the responses are optimized, and you can see it visually. I find it pretty beautiful, and then it's something that we're kind of experimenting with. Not a lot of psychologists have used this method before. One thing I like to do is just get inspiration from other fields. So models, if it works in engineering, if it works in the biosciences, maybe it would work for us. I'm not sure if I could say which ones are the most creative, because it would be like saying which one's the most fit for what's needed. But maybe somebody would say the ones that are equally both appropriate and originality, that would be like a 50-50 weighting. Although I don't know if I'm willing to go out on the limb and say that.
Right.
Maybe different weightings are good for different occasions.
Can you give an example of a couple of the prompts?
Oh,
Gave like one was designing a car to optimize fuel usage. So what are some other prompts you gave these kids?
Oh, well, that was an example from engineering, but the prompts for kids are pretty simple divergent thinking tasks. Like that we give like an instances task where they ask what is an example of something that's blank, and there's adjectives, like we have colors, we have other types of adjectives, like what's an example of something that's loud? What's an example of something that's smelly? The kids love that one. We also have a typical uses task where we ask the kids, here's a pen. Actually, we use pencil, but here's a pencil. I know you could write with this pencil, but what's a surprising thing I could do with this pencil? What's something unusual I could do with it? And we also have a complete the sentence task where it's written to look almost like a typical reading comprehension measure that a child would see, but instead they're completing the sentence in the most original and surprising way. So the sentence would read something like, when the teacher was talking, all the kids blank. And they can fill in whatever they want, and they're directed to fill it in a surprising way. And so many kids will write things like, when the teacher was talking, the kids took notes, right? It's like a highly task appropriate, not very original response. But other children will write things like, when the teacher was talking, the kids traveled through time riding on the back of a rainbow unicorn. They'll write something so imaginative that it's original, but not particularly realistic or appropriate. So I find these differences in children's thinking just fascinating. And I'm not sure if we're like at the verge of cracking the code or something like that, but at least in the study I'll present today, I hope it will be an interesting exploration of all the different types of responses you get, how different children choose to emphasize originality as opposed to appropriateness, or how a child might do the opposite, emphasize appropriateness as opposed to originality. When do they kind of go right down the middle? And what attributes predict being able to balance them? Like, for example, one thing we found is that the children who gave more optimal responses, they scored more highly on both reading and math standardized assessments. But actually, just one was not enough. It had to be both. I thought that was kind of a fascinating finding, especially because it was a fully verbal test. I had expected reading ability to play a part, but I wasn't as much expecting. I was surprised by the role that the math assessment played in predicting which kids could think of these ideas, even though they're verbal.
Oh, yeah, that is fascinating. So I think I understand when you talk about the front that optimizes, you're talking about optimizing those two criteria, which would be originality and then appropriateness. So if you finish the sentence in some crazy way, then it just doesn't make any sense. So what you're looking at is the optimal balance of novelty and appropriateness.
Yeah.
And you've got this methodology which allows you to do that.
Yeah, precisely. I think about it like navigating a trade-off. Like with these kinds of very domain general tasks, the kids have to decide how much are they willing to trade off utility or appropriateness, feasibility of the idea, and how much are they willing to give that up in order to get originality. And you get really interesting differences along that spectrum. So I'm fascinated by it. Yeah, navigating a trade-off is what I would say.
And you're bringing it together, like you said, you're getting this methodology, which sounds pretty complicated, really, but it hasn't been applied to this kind of creativity question before.
Yeah, as far as I know, it's never been applied in educational psychology ever before. I've read some papers in IO Psych where they've done it for identification for hiring, but I've never heard of or seen it done with children's educational data ever. It mainly comes from engineering. I've seen a lot of it in the biosciences too. I was inspired to do it by an analysis from an economist. So one of my things I like to do, I think it supports my creativity, is just read really widely and then think, oh, well, that person might be an engineer, but what are they doing that I could bring into my craft, that I could bring into my discipline? Learn the method, get it to run, and see if it teaches us anything. And I'm going to be fascinated to see if anyone in the audience thinks they learn anything, because I think I learned something from it, and I'm really going to be hopeful that there'll be a couple people in the audience at least that will think, oh, I hadn't thought of children's ideas quite this way. So that's my goal.
Right. Well, that's why we're all here, is to go to presentations like yours and learn something, learn a lot.
Yeah. I hope it'll happen. That would be wonderful.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
This was pretty technical, but I think you can still get the core idea that there's always a need to balance novelty and appropriateness, and there are a lot of different ways to resolve this balance. It's an important lesson for children and for students who are still developing their creative abilities. This is the first of 2 episodes about the conference, and to wrap up this episode, I was really fortunate to talk to Professor Mike Mumford. He's one of the most influential creativity researchers in the last 50 years. In fact, he's been doing research for just about 50 years. He's been publishing scientific work since the 1970s. In 2006, I published my first creativity textbook. It's called Explaining Creativity. And back then, I drew on his research to help develop my own theories about the creative process. Professor Mumford is going to give us a big picture about creativity. It's a broad perspective that he's gotten from a lifetime of creativity research.
I'm here with Professor Mike Mumford, and he's been at this conference for many, many years. So tell me what you think about this year's conference.
This is our second year where the conference is unique to the division. And that has been a huge need amongst creativity and innovation people for many years, partly because of reduction in time from APA, because of clinical demand on the American Psychological Association. Last year was successful for a first conference for a division. It was 100 and some people. It was productive. People learned a lot. People had a good time. This year, size of the conference has doubled. We are not at 100 people. We're at like 220 people. We're at 160 papers. Interestingly, the audience is very young for an academic conference, which I find heartwarming. I'm sitting here with Keith Sawyer. Keith Sawyer and I are close to the same age. I can remember that if you had a creativity meeting or a creativity conference, you were talking 20, 25 people, maybe. 200 is very different, and they're all young, and they're all engaged. And it is far more empirically based than has been traditionally the case. This is heartwarming. It's heartwarming for the division. It also reflects the growing impact of creativity culturally and economically. In the future, education is going to be much more driven to creativity than it is now, partly because of AI systems. Economically, it has become absolutely apparent if large firms want to survive, they must engage in sustained innovation. That requires sustained creativity. So the growth here isn't, at some levels, economically and culturally surprising, but it is really heartwarming to see. The field itself, I remember the days where we had one journal, Journal of Creative Behavior. That was it. All of us published in different places. I published in leadership journals. Teresa Mobley published in business journals. Keith published in music journals. We all published in non-creativity places. Now we're up to 7 journals. Our 4 or 5 big journals are quite successful. They are widely read. And the impact in the real world has become substantial. So I'll use me as an example. Every year, I go off to either MIT or Stanford to teach a course to vice presidents for research and development for European firms. IKEA, Volvo, Siemens, etc. These people take creativity and the development of creativity in their workforces deadly seriously. And when I talk to these people, they will ask questions not so much about the value of creativity. They will listen to exactly what you say about it and have comments. The question they will ask is, how do I develop creativity in my people? And sometimes we can answer it and sometimes we can't. Depends on the specific context of the question. But that tells me how fundamental creativity has become to industry, and particularly R&D industry. The time of routine discovery is done. You will appreciate this, the audience might not. For many years, NSF would not fund creativity research. They would not. And their view was, creativity is not critical to science. Science is a matter of discovery. Over the last 10 years, NSF has figured out that, no, science needs creativity. That's a significant change. National Institutes of Health is starting to look at creativity, which is amazing to me personally. The educational system is slowly, very slowly, thinking that teachers might develop creativity in their student. I would say one thing with this, and this comes from the military, my experience with the military and enhancing creativity. It wasn't really difficult to sell the military that military operations required creativity. What was hard is getting them to culturally adapt to developing creativity in younger soldiers. I see the same thing with the educational system. The teachers don't want to quite vote. They don't want to make their classes too difficult. Real creative education makes classes more difficult. They lose the weaker students. They don't want them to get depressed. It's going to take a lot of research and a lot of social system change to have the impact we should be having. But to get there, you have to do the research first, and the research has become much better.
And when you say there's over 200 people here at this conference, those are 200 scientific researchers. Those aren't just people off the street interested in creativity. So these people really are contributing original research.
Oh, yeah. The one thing you can say about Division 10, it is a society for doctorate degree holders.
Right. Very serious research. The presentations I've been in. And when you say papers, you mean someone standing up and giving a presentation about their research. Yeah, so we've got 220 full-time researchers. Oh, and about half of them are PhD students. Right. They're like apprentice researchers.
Apprentice researchers. And note there's something a little bit unusual here. Departments are sending doctoral students to a professional conference.
That's right. I never went when I was a doctoral student.
I didn't either. So the universities are actually supporting creativity. We have Yale that is invested in this. We've had North Texas invested in this. We have the University of Utah invested in this. And I will tell you an odd thing. This is actually true. It's always hard to get money out of universities. The federal government is much easier than universities. No one has had problems getting support from universities for this conference.
Yeah.
They will always ante up a certain amount of cash. They will always ante up a certain amount of support. And it's because the universities see where this is going. And that's heartwarming to me. You think back to the to the mid-70s to late 70s. It was questionable whether it would be a creativity and innovation field. It really was. I was not sure when I started out. When I applied for my first job, a senior faculty member asked me, what are you going to do? And I said, creativity. He looked at me and goes, well, somebody has to do it. No, really.
Wait, what year? Was that in the 70s or 80s?
That was 85. And it was Larry James, who's coming out of the Utah group many years before. But at that point, no one who was studying industrial psychology was studying creativity at all. That's changed substantially. The business schools have gotten a lot more serious about it, partly because of the engineering programs, but partly because the data is saying how fundamental innovation is for firms. So the firms are starting to manage themselves for sustained innovation. Google being an example, Microsoft being an example. It is interesting the arts are linked to this, but I'll give you, so I'm imparting a really bizarre story. I went to Buffalo for my undergraduate degree, which is basically an engineering business school. The arts department, the fine arts department, is co-housed with the business school across from the engineering school. That is the change we're seeing. That it is literally, even the aesthetics are being embedded in engineering and business. Hopefully, the aesthetics will get embedded more than they have been, hopefully, in the educational system. Why am I saying that? I'm a trained classical musician, and I would say, by the way, classical musicians have nothing to do with creativity at all in any way, shape, or form. But my brother is a fine artist, and a reasonably successful fine artist. When he went through high school and college, there was opportunity to be an artist. I'm afraid frequently the school systems have taken that opportunity away. And I hope one thing the aesthetic and arts folks do is get that embedded back in the educational system. And watching what's going on with this conference, I think that's likely the case long term.
Right. Well, I'd say if you're interested in art, or if you're interested in applying psychological research methods to art, then this conference is the place to be. So yeah, Professor Mike Mumford, thank you for spending time with me.
It was enjoyable. Goodbye, everyone.
Dr. Mumford was the perfect person to give us the last word on this episode. We've heard from 5 people who presented at the conference. Dr. Lamb talked about imagination, Dr. Rahimi talked about AI, Dr. Kesari, improv theater, Dr. Dumas about children's creativity, and Dr. Mumford about the broad arc of research into our understanding of creativity. If you'd like to learn more about their research and about the interviews, I transcribed this episode and I posted it to my Substack newsletter. That's keithsawyer.substack.com. You can also find links to their websites in the newsletter and in the episode notes. Most of this research is just now coming out of the laboratory. We're still figuring out the implications for everyday life. But I'm convinced that cutting-edge research is the best way to advance our understanding of creativity and to increase our abilities to create effectively. I think these 5 creativity researchers deserve a round of applause. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.